Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Accad and Koka report. Over the last 2.5 years, a significant segment of the population has interpreted the pandemic response and its policies of lockdowns, business closures, vaccine mandates, mask mandates, and so on, as being nothing short of totalitarian. And it considered compliance with those policies as a sign of the power of propaganda. In contrast, another significant segment of the population has welcomed those policies as necessary and perhaps even insufficient, not going far enough to curb the ravages of the pandemic. It considered those who refuse to, quote, follow science, unquote, as a group of self-interested individuals giving free rein to the virus for their own misguided self-interest, set to destroy the fragile fabric of society. Each group viewed the other with complete bewilderment, as if living in an alternate reality. Our guest on the show today is Professor Mattias Desmet from the University of Ghent in Belgium. In the fall of 2021, Professor Desmet gave a series of interviews to shed light on this phenomenon. Those interviews garnered millions of views on social media. Overnight, the term mass formation, which Professor Desmet used to explain the current events, was on everyone's lips. Since then, Professor Desmet has written a book titled The Psychology of Totalitarianism. Professor Desmet, welcome to the Accad and Koka report.
Thank you for inviting me, Michel.
We are delighted to have you, Mattias. Thank you very much for joining us. I didn't mention, you're a professor of psychology at the University of Ghent.
That's right.
Is that correct? I'm going to ask you to help us define the term totalitarianism to begin with, because for most people, when we use it, we think about brown shirts marching through the streets, and maybe there's a more accurate meaning. And then I'll ask you also you're a professor of psychology. How did you come to think about those issues? So first, what is totalitarianism? What do we mean by that term?
Yes, well, totalitarianism, the first one important thing is to distinguish it from a classical dictatorship. A totalitarian state is a kind of a state system that is often mistaken for a classical dictatorship. In a classical dictatorship is based on a very primitive, simple psychological mechanism. In a classical dictatorship, the population is scared of a small group, the so-called dictatorial regime, because they have the impression that this dictatorial regime has a huge aggressive potential, they just accept that this regime imposes unilaterally its social contract to society. That's about what a classical dictatorship is just the population who is in the grip of fear for a small group of people, a dictatorial regime. A totalitarian state is based on a completely different psychological phenomenon. And a totalitarian state is based on the phenomenon of mass formation or crowd formation, which is a specific kind of group formation, which makes that people are fanatically in the grip of a certain narrative or a certain ideology. For instance, the race theories in Nazi Germany, or Marxist historical materialism in the Soviet Union in the beginning of the 20th century. And once this mass formation, this phenomenon of mass formation manifests, once there is like a large group of the population who is in the grip, who fanatically believes in a certain ideology, you only need a few leaders who take the lead of the masses, and very often you see that this diabolic pact between the leaders and the masses is capable of seizing control of society. And in this case, a totalitarian state emerges, which is something completely different than a classical dictatorship. A totalitarian state controls not only political space and public space, such as a classical dictatorship does, but also private life, because a totalitarian state has a huge secret police, namely this part of the population that fanatically believes in the state narrative, which is usually about 20 to 30% and of the population. And this totalitarian state, before the 20th century, there was no such thing as a totalitarian state. It simply didn't exist. And the first totalitarian states were indeed the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. But in 1951, back in 1951, Hannah Arendt, the Jewish German philosopher who wrote this wonderful book on totalitarianism, The Origins of Totalitarianism, warned us already that we had seen the collapse of Nazi Germany, and we probably would see the collapse of the Soviet Union soon, she said in 1951. But we will see the emergence of a new kind of totalitarianism, she said. A new kind of totalitarianism, which is no longer led by gang leaders such as Stalin and Hitler, but which is led by dull bureaucrats and technocrats. So Hannah Arendt anticipated the emergence of a so-called technocratic totalitarianism, which relies very strongly on technological control and which is led by technical experts. And I think that was back in 2017. I started to have the impression that this technocratic totalitarianism was emerging in our society. And I started to take notes about this process of totalitarianization. And then during the Corona crisis, last year in August 2021, I started to write the writing of my book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, and I finished it in 4 months and published it this year. So that was when I started to think about totalitarianism.
Right. So let's talk about, I mean, this is, thank you. Corona, tell us to what extent, I mean, how does the Corona response exemplify totalitarianism? Many people think today, I mean, we'll say at least, we'll think that this is maybe an exaggeration. You know, I mean, we're free to come and go. Tell us a little bit how you experienced the beginning of the pandemic and why you think it meets the definition, especially nowadays, as a lot of the policies have been rolled back. The vaccine mandates, the lockdowns, all these things have been in a way rolled back. Isn't that sort of a contradiction to say that it's totalitarian if it's being scaled back?
No, because you have to distinguish between the level of ideology and the level of the narratives that are used to promote an ideology. And the ideology in this crisis is like the technocratic transhumanist ideology. And this transhumanist technocratic ideology just believes that society should be reshaped in such a way that it can be strictly technologically controlled. And because they believe that this is the only way to face the problems, the challenges, such as climate change, maybe also terrorism, all kinds of pandemics or diseases. So there are many people who believe the idea that only technological control can save us from the problems we are facing, and that if we can establish a society that is strictly controlled in a technological way and that is led by rationalist, technocratic experts, that we will be able to create like a kind of a paradise, a transhumanist paradise. That is the ideology that is lurking in the background, and that since maybe 100 years or even more is the ideology that organizes our society, and that is the ideology that is believed in by the major institutions in the world. So I believe that at the level of the ideology, we see a constant increase in the grip of this kind of technocratic transhumanist ideology on the world, on society. And there are a series of narratives that emerge in society, such as the war on terror, or the narrative on climate change, or the narrative on the Corona crisis, that are all used, or that in one way or another help society, help to convince society that we need these ideological reorientations, that we need to reshape society urgently in the direction of a more technological controlled society. So that tendency won't stop now. It's not because the corona narrative disappears in the background a little bit that this tendency towards a more technocratic society, towards a more technologically controlled society stops. We will see how the digital IDs will be introduced shortly. We see how all the central banks prepare themselves for the introduction of digital coins and so on. Mm-hmm. So that tendency towards technocracy won't stop because the corona narrative disappears a little bit in the background. And by the way, I believe in a few months that the corona narrative will be reactivated. It's not because it's less prominently there in the media now that it disappeared. So I don't think that the tendency towards the technocratic totalitarian society.
Right. You know, that's very interesting. I mean, you talked earlier about totalitarianism being interested in the private lives and inserting itself into the private lives of the citizens. And as you said, this has been going on for quite a while, even before, I mean, certainly before the corona crisis. I mean, to the point that it's almost, I mean, unquestioned that governments and states should have something to say about how we live our lives. I mean, that's been going on for, what do you think? I mean, I have a certain bias, but the people who listen to the show know about it. But even the major social programs like health insurance, you know, the government providing health insurance or licensing medicine or whatnot. I mean, all these are sort of intrusions into private lives. And in a way, I think they sort of set the stage, right? So it's not, strictly speaking, technological in the sense that they're trying to implant chips in people and whatnot. But it is in a way the idea that our lives will be regulated by rules about, you know, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable for our own good, right? The good of the private, you know, our own private goods, which is a very different political philosophy than what it was under, let's say, I don't know, even the absolutist kings of the Louis XIV couldn't care less about the welfare of the peasants, right? Whereas now we have these governments that, and it's quite well embraced by the population. So you talk about the conditions in the population that give rise to totalitarianism and make it accepted. Tell us about this a little bit. These conditions. I mean, there's something different about the societies today.
Yes. Yeah. If you want to understand the phenomenon of totalitarianism, you have to understand the phenomenon of mass formation, because mass formation is the basis on which totalitarianism is built. Mass formation is a specific kind of group formation, and which became constantly stronger throughout the last few hundreds of years. Until the masses became so powerful that they could seize control over society, helped by their leaders, of course. But mass formation is like, it's a specific kind of group formation, which has very specific, remarkable effects at the level of individual mental functioning. Once an individual is in the grip of a process of mass formation, it will typically become incapable of taking a critical distance of what the group believes in. So it is as if people become radically blind for everything that goes against what the group believes in. And that can go quite far. For instance, in 1979, there was when the revolution in Iran started, there also started a large-scale process of mass formation, and people typically started to believe that the portrait, the picture, the photo of the Ayatollah, who was considered the leader of the masses, was printed on the surface of the moon. And when there was a full moon in the sky, they pointed at the moon. They were standing in the streets, pointing at the moon, showing each other where exactly the picture of the Ayatollah could be observed on the surface of the moon. That's a very small example. I could give many more examples. But the strange thing is that people, as soon as they are in the grip of mass formation, they can believe the most absurd narratives And in one way or another, even highly intelligent people start to be incapable of taking a critical distance of what the group believes in. That's one typical characteristic of mass formation. And then a second one is that once people are in the grip of mass formation, they become radically willing to self-sacrifice, to sacrifice themselves. People who are in the grip of mass formation are no longer aware of their own individual interests. It is as if they want to sacrifice everything that was important for them before the mass formation for the sake of the collective. And the third major characteristic of mass formation is that once people are in the grip of mass formation, they become radically intolerant for dissonant voices, for people who think differently than the masses. And this can go quite far. In the end, the masses typically start to commit cruelties and atrocities towards everyone who doesn't go along with them. And they do so, and that's very striking, they do so as if it is an ethical duty to commit these atrocities. For instance, I was talking with a woman who lived in Iran during the revolution in Iran, during the mass formation there in Iran, and she said, she told me how she had seen with her own eyes how a mother reported her son to the state, and how this mother hung the rope around the neck of her son when he was on the scaffold, just before he was hung, and how she claimed to be a heroine for doing so. That's typical, the end stage of mass formation. So that's the phenomenological characteristics of a mass formation. But as soon as you understand its mechanisms, then you also understand why people, in the end, start to do such things as they do in the masses, and also what you can do about it. And that's, of course, crucial in times like these,
right,
that we understand the mechanism, and that we also understand what we can do about it.
Definitely, we want to address this, but let me understand this a little bit closer. I mean, mass phenomena and mass movements have occurred throughout history. So it's clarify to me what's the difference about what's going on in totalitarianism versus mass formation. I mean, you can talk about big religious, I mean, the rise of Christianity, the rise of Islam. I mean, are these would these fit under mass formation movements? And what about more benign things like, you know, a soccer game or a football game where people just all of a sudden, you know, act as one, you know, as a mass? I mean, is mass formation sort of a generic term that can have different applications, some benign, some less benign, and so forth? Or are you talking about it particularly, you know, specifically in relationship to the rise of totalitarianism? So clarify that for me.
Mass formation has existed as long as mankind exists.
Okay.
And typical examples of mass formation were the Crusades, the witch hunts, the French Revolution, and later on the emergence of Soviet Stalinism and Nazism. Certain religious organizations can be considered masses, and the emergence of religious phenomena sometimes belongs to the category of the mass formations. Not all of them, of course, but there is one huge difference between the masses of ancient times and the masses in modern times, and it is that the masses in modern times last much longer or stronger, and that has to do with the fact that there is mass media now. If a mass formation emerges in a society without mass media, it usually will not last very long. But if the narrative that leads to the mass formation is redisseminated, redistributed time and time again through the mass media, then the mass formations might last very long. And also there is one crucial difference between the modern masses and the ancient masses, and that is that the modern masses are so-called lonely masses, meaning that the modern masses often don't gather physically. For instance, the mass or the crowd that emerged in the corona crisis never gathered physically. The mass, we were dealing with the mass formation because many people were in the grip of the same ideas, the same thoughts, and in the grip of the same images, in the grip of the same narratives and myths that were constructed about the coronavirus. But the masses didn't meet physically. The masses of ancient times were always physical masses, masses that emerged in the physical presence of the members of the mass. And that's an enormously important difference, because in a lonely mass, when people form a mass without being physically together, then all the individuals constituting the mass are living in a more or less isolated way. And that's the optimal condition, the optical condition for propaganda. People who are lonely masses are extremely sensitive and vulnerable for propaganda. And if this propaganda can be distributed time and time again through mass media, then propaganda can be extremely efficient. So that's one. There are more differences, of course, between the modern masses and the ancient masses, but the fact that the modern masses are lonely masses is, I think, the most important difference between the two. So there's this.
Right.
It's that precisely, that characteristic of the modern masses that makes that mass formation could become the basis of a new state system. Without these large, long-lasting masses who are in the grip of narratives that are distributed through mass media, no such thing as a totalitarian state could emerge.
Okay, and these lonely masses are. One difficulty is that they are led, but they're not led by a political party the way Nazi Germany was led, right? Or the way the Soviet Unions were led. So there's a more pervasive ideology. I think that's the point that you make. A more pervasive ideology that makes it such that this phenomenon of technocratic totalitarianism emerges. At the same time, it seems to, at least to some of us, that there are some people who are in charge, so to speak, and lead this. And so what's the distinction? I mean, is this a sort of a spontaneous movement, or is it being led deliberately, or what? How do you parse that out? Yeah.
I think it's a mixture. It's very often a mixture between the two. And a totalitarian state can actually emerge in two ways. And for instance, it's the way in which the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany emerged are perfect examples. In the Soviet Union, first there was an elite, a group of intellectuals who were fanatically convinced of historical materialism, of Marx, and who used indoctrination and propaganda, first on a small scale, later on a larger scale, to provoke a mass formation in the Soviet Union. So through indoctrination propaganda, they could provoke this phenomenon of mass formation in the population. And then this elite used the masses to seize control of society in Russia of the first half of the 20th century. In Germany, it went the other way around. In Germany, the mass formation emerged in a spontaneous way. So a certain segment of the population started to become in the grip of certain race theories, and from the masses, slowly, a Nazist elite emerged. Talented speakers who, in one way or another, could take the lead of the masses, and who started to form a political party, and who also, helped by the masses, could seize power of German society. So in both, it can happen in two ways. Either the elite is first and then the masses emerge, or the masses are first and then from the masses the elite emerges. But in both scenarios, the ultimate effect is the same. It's this diabolic pact between the masses and the elite that lead to totalitarian states. Here in this case, I believe you have to do with a mixture of the two. Of course, there was this all kinds of large societal institutions who wanted to have more control over society, who believed that a strict technological control would be necessary to control climate change, for instance, to name only one thing, and who were waiting for opportunities to impose their technocratic model to society. And then, at a certain moment, the corona narrative started to have a grip on society. And of course, it was an excellent tool, the corona narrative, to use in order to convince people to accept the introduction of, for instance, QR codes. And also now, these QR codes who will be a preliminary stage before the introduction of digital IDs, for instance.
Right.
So it's a mixture between the two, I think. But the most important thing, I believe, is that the entire process, like if throughout the last few hundred years, the phenomenon of mass formation became increasingly strong. And the most important thing, I think, is to see that this is a consequence of our view on men and the world, and more in particular, of our mechanist, materialist view on man and the world. As soon as we understand that, we start to understand what we have to do, or which steps should be taken to really get rid of the problem of totalitarianism.
Right. Let's get into this in one moment, but I want to clarify one thing here that you mentioned in your book. I think is very important. That what we're witnessing is not a conspiracy, in the sense that the elites are sort of behind closed door concocting their technological machinations. Because, as you said, I mean, a lot of it is in the open. I mean, these elite institutions that have this dream of this technocratically controlled society have had their proposals up in the open for years. Right. I mean, these digital ID, I mean, right now, the World Economic Forum talks about openly that there should be abolishment of private property, and everybody should be happy with their, metaverse, virtual reality, and everybody will be content and so forth. So it's not a conspiracy in the sense that it's not a cabal trying to work behind the scenes to do this. I mean, it's actually quite open, and then there's a certain segment of our population that seems to sort of respond to it, even though they don't necessarily believe in the. I mean, it's not that they have a view that they want chips implanted in them, or that they want to have digital IDs, but there's a certain deal of security that is provided, right? I mean, it's a promise. It's a promise of security, a promise of peace, and a promise that the existential trouble of mankind will be sort of taken care of. Yeah, so that leads us to what you were just mentioning. So at the beginning of your book, it is wonderful. You give sort of a background thinking that is sort of very pervasive and has been for several hundred years. That is now leading to this phenomenon that we see of repeated mass formations that are more and more intense. And you call this the mechanistic ideology. Explain to us what that's about, and how did it emerge? And how does it explain the way society is now a society of lonely crowds, so to speak?
Yeah, indeed. Somewhere in the beginning of the 16th century, the religious view on man and the world was progressively replaced by the so-called materialist mechanist view on the man and the world, which considers the universe to be a kind of a material machine, a set of elementary particles, molecules and atoms that all interact with each other according to the laws of mechanics, and that can be described perfectly in a rational, logical way. And so as this view on man and the world became dominant, the world was progressively industrialized, and more technology was used in a very excessive way. And it's clear that it is this process of the mechanization of the world, of the industrialization of the world, and also of the increasing use of technology, that in the end disconnects people from their natural and their social environment. That connection, that relationship between the industrialization of the world and the use of technology on the one hand, And the rise of the number of people who feel disconnected and lonely in society has been well observed and well described by several authors. And in my book, I give several examples showing how exactly this mechanism works, like the mechanization of the world, the industrialization of the world, the use of technology, in one way or another, always promise to make our lives easier and more comfortable. And that's actually what they also do to a certain extent. But at the same time, they also take something away. They also destroy something. They destroy, to a certain extent, the subtle connection between the human being and this natural and social environment. And it's in this way that the mechanistic view on man and the world, on the one hand, because it leads to this industrialization of the world and the use of technology, creates the conditions that make mass formation flourish. And so because the most crucial condition for mass formation, for a large scale mass formation to emerge in society, is always that there have to be a lot of people who feel disconnected from their environment. That's the root cause of the phenomenon of mass formation. And then just before the corona crisis, we could see that worldwide, 30% of the people reported that they didn't have one meaningful relationship and that they connected only to other people through the internet. So that's baffling, 30% of the people worldwide. And then once people feel disconnected from their environment, they will typically start to be confronted with so-called lack of meaning making, or with lack of meaning making, just because people are social beings. And if the connection, the social bond, the bond with other people deteriorates or impoverishes, then they will typically start to be confronted with experiences of lack of meaning making without being aware of the fact that these experiences of lack of meaning making are connected to the lack of social bond. And also that you could see clearly before the corona crisis, that the number of people who were confronted with lack of meaning making peaked. There were like 60% of the people worldwide reported that they considered their own job to be a so-called bullshit job, a job without meaning or purpose. And once people are in this state, this disconnected state, and confronted with lack of meaning making, something important happens at the level of their affective lives. They will typically be confronted then with so-called free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression, which is a kind of anxiety, frustration, and aggression that cannot be connected to a mental representation, or, in other words, people will feel anxious, frustrated, and aggressive without knowing what they feel anxious, frustrated, and aggressive for. And it's this state that is very aversive. And when people feel anxious and they don't know what they feel anxious for, they will typically feel completely out of control, as if they cannot control their anxiety, as they don't know what they feel anxious for. And it is in this state that something very specific might happen. If under these conditions, a narrative is distributed through the mass media, indicating an object of anxiety and a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety, then all this freely floating anxiety might connect to the object of anxiety, and people might be willing to participate in a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, even if the strategy seems utterly absurd. So that's what happens in the first step of mass formation. That happens in every major mass formation, whether we are talking about the Crusades or the witch hunts or the French Revolution or Nazi Germany, it doesn't matter. The first step in mass formation is this. All this free-floating anxiety connects to the object of anxiety and provided, indicated in a narrative, and people all start to participate in a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. For instance, the concentration camps to deal with the Jews, the witch hunts to deal with the witches, the Crusades to deal with the Muslims, and so on, or the corona measures to deal with the coronavirus. And that's the first step. It's a very important step. It's very attractive because in this way people can control their anxiety, and they can also start to anticipate the moment in which they will be allowed to direct all their frustration and aggression on the people who do not participate in the battle with the object of anxiety. And once this happens, a next step happens, meaning that because there are so many people who participate at the same time in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, they have the feeling that they are connected again. They have the feeling that a new kind of social bond emerges, or in other words, they have the feeling that the most basic precondition for mass formation, the loneliness and the disconnectedness, disappeared in society. But, and that's the crucial thing, you could say, like, look, what's the problem? People felt disconnected and lonely, and now they feel connected again. So what's the problem with this mass formation? Well, there is a problem, and it is that this new kind of social bond is never a social bond between individuals. It's a social bond between an individual and the collective. Meaning that a mass or a crowd is a group that is formed not because individuals connect to each other, but because all the individuals separately connect to the collective. And so in the end, the longer a mass formation lasts, the weaker the bonds between individuals become, and the stronger the bonds between the individual and the collective. And that explains why, in the end, the bonds between individuals, even individuals who used to love each other very much before the mass formation, become so weak, and the bond between the individual and the collective becomes so strong that people are willing to report even the people whom they loved most before the mass formation to the state. I refer to this woman who reported her son to the state and who hung the rope around his neck. Well, that's typically the end effect of mass formation. We've seen this in the Corona crisis as well. People were all talking of solidarity, and at the same time they accepted that if someone got an accident on the street, they were no longer allowed to help that person. It was mentioned like that on the websites of the Belgian, the Dutch, the European government, and probably also on the website of the government of the United States, that you were no longer allowed to help someone who got an accident on the street, unless you had a surgical mask and surgical gloves at your disposal. That means nobody has. Nobody. And for the same reason, and in the same vein, people accepted that we were all talking about solidarity with the elderly, and at the same time, we accepted that if our father or mother, or most people accepted, that if their father or mother was dying somewhere, they were not allowed to visit them while they were dying. So that shows this strange solidarity, which is so typical for totalitarian systems. In totalitarian systems, everyone, or the people who are really totalitarian, want to sacrifice everything, themselves and their loved ones, for the sake of solidarity with the system.
With an abstraction, nothing, right? With a
no, it's just an abstract, collective ideal for which.
It's interesting. You mentioned you spend a lot. Your focus, of course, in the book and in your discussions has been on the mass formation that's occurring among the technocrats. The technocrats, if you listen to them, I listened to a very prominent cardiologist, one of the fathers of cardiology, recently giving a lecture, and he was describing something very similar, and saying this is consuming the masses. The masses are being engaged by a charismatic leader in the form of, in 2016, in the form of Donald Trump, to create a monolithic group that threatens harmony and threatens the world. And the echoes between what you're saying and your discussions about the elites and this technocratic state and folks doing things that are absurd. And that group thinks the same thing of everyone else.
Yes, I know.
What are your so does this book, in terms of your focus, does it reflect your underlying biases, our underlying biases, in terms of where we're directing we want a solution to this, of course, and we're saying, okay, we want a solution to this technocratic state. I'm pretty sure the other side thinks very differently.
Yeah,
why focus on one versus the other?
That's a great question. Before you answer, Mattias, I'm going to ask the same question in a different way. People will say, who are sort of in favor of the technocratic ideal, would say, listen, before the 16th century, you had constant wars of religion, constant strife. So at least with science, okay, you may have these phenomena, they will, find their own explanation for totalitarianism and whatnot. But they say that overall, there's been technology, we live longer, the world is well fed, all these things. And so I imagine that's how they would view it or defend it. And then they would say anything that goes against their technological ideal as being, completely naive and a throwback, wanting to get us back to pure subjective, notions and maybe religious wars and that sort of thing.
Yeah, sure. I don't intend to say that we have to go back to the world as it existed before the 16th century. We have to move on, and we have to transcend our rationalist view on man in the world. We don't have to lapse into irrationality, but we have to transcend it. But maybe I will first answer the first question.
Right. Okay.
Definitely, when a large mass formation emerged, as happened, I think, in the Corona crisis, and it was clear that it was a mass formation, suddenly there were these two new groups in society, a group that bought into the Corona narrative and a group that didn't. And these two new groups, the dividing line between these two groups runs straight through every pre-existing group formation in society. Families were split into, companies were split into, political parties were split into, all dependent on what your opinion was on the virus. You belonged to the one camp or to the other camp, and it were two entirely new camps, which did not exist before the Corona crisis. So I really believe that it is clear that there was a huge, large-scale phenomenon of mass formation during the Corona crisis. But of course, the group who didn't buy into the Corona narrative, this group who, in one way or another, was not vulnerable for this mass formation, might form a mass in itself. And in this way, you have a polarization in society. You have, on the one hand, you have a large mass, and on the other hand, you have a small mass. And these two masses function if the group who doesn't go along with the Corona narrative also forms a mass. Then you will see how two masses, a large one and a small one, both functioning according to the same destructive principles, will confront each other. And usually that means that the small mass will be destroyed. So the group who doesn't go along with the mainstream narrative should watch out not to form a mass itself, or it will probably destroy itself in this way. So of course there can be several mass formations alongside each other in society, and I can understand the people who go along with the mainstream narrative, that they criticize the people who do not go along with the mainstream narrative and say that it is them who are vulnerable for mass formation. To a certain extent, that could be true. To a certain extent, that could be true, yes. But in my opinion, definitely the most dangerous mass is now the mainstream mass, and it is the mass that is absorbed in this technocratic ideology, I believe. Or at least who is not aware of the dangerousness of this ideology, and who is not aware of the fact that the Corona narrative might lead to the emergence of a technocratic system. Well, did I answer that question, that first question, in this way?
I think so. I need to drop for a second, but I think so. But let me push a little bit more. So, to what extent do you account for the fact that not everybody? I mean, we all live in the same society, but not everybody seems to be in the grip, as you say, of the mass formation, or to a less degree, and maybe some become, in a reactive mass formation, sort of opposite the mainstream mass formation. so to speak. But what accounts for the fact that that there are some people who are not, who intuitively, when the coronavirus crisis emerged, intuitively were sort of more skeptical and more guarded and said, there's something fishy here. Now, it could be that some people are, have very, very strong critical, powers of critical thinking and can be detached and analyze things. But that's not my impression. My impression is that most people who react against the narrative have reacted on the basis of a certain intuition, as opposed to very strong analytical skills or thinking.
No, nobody knows exactly why a certain group of people is resilient to mass formation and doesn't fall prey to it. Nobody knows that exactly, why it is. You can try to explain it. It will probably have to do with the fact that the people who do not go along with the mass formation, in one way or another, feel a certain aversion for the underlying ideology. For instance, this technocratic, rationalist, transhumanist ideology that is under the surface of the corona narrative. But I'm not sure about it. I'm not sure.
Okay.
It has been, as long as the phenomenon of mass formation is studied, this has been an open question as to why a certain group of people, for one reason or another, does not fall prey to to mass formation. Yeah, it's a very good question.
Okay, so Mattias, how do you counter? So, but let me summarize a little bit because it's very rich here. Your thesis is that starting in the 16th, 17th century, there was sort of a rejection of preceding norms that were primarily religious norms, and to replace them with a certain mechanistic understanding of the world, even at the material level, the material world being sort of like a machine. Interestingly, I know that story a little bit, and what's interesting is that actually it had theological origins. What happens that the thinkers of those days started to imagine God as an engineer, as a machine maker, and they thought that was a better explanation for the world than God allowing spontaneous natures, human natures, dog natures, plant natures, being sort of independent of God. So there was a desire to give more to the omnipotence of God by making him sort of a machine maker, and rearranging atoms and molecules and things according to his will. So that was the origin of the mechanistic thinking, and essentially the origin of the scientific revolution. But so your idea is that sort of has provided a lot of benefit in terms of comfort at some level. Although I think that's a little bit difficult to quantify because a lot of people have sort of suffered at the same time along with those benefits.
Yes,
It's impossible to sort of put a utilitarian sum to the whole thing. But eventually, sort of that has moved into the kinds of political order that we live in right now, which is, an administrative state that is very, very deeply involved into the lives of everybody, and now has the means via mass media and social medias to sort of manipulate things in ways that are extremely powerful and can be sustained, and that's sort of the ideological order of the day that gives rise to these episodic phenomena of mass formation and whatnot. And we've lived through several in the 20th century. Now the coronavirus, which may not be completely dead. Certainly, if you look at China, it's not dead at all. It's still alive and well there, and but it may take on different forms because each of these are not. You mentioned in the book, we may not get into it. They sort of contain their seeds of their own destructions, these variations. So now how do we get out of this? If we're not happy, I completely agree with you that there's. I think everybody experiences that, this phenomenon of free-floating anxiety. The doctor's office. I mean, I see, 30-40%. I don't know. I can't quantify it, but a lot of doctor visits are sort of manifestations of free-floating anxiety, even before the coronavirus. I mean, people come to the doctor to express, anxieties that manifest themselves in physical terms. So how do you envision getting out of this?
Yes.
Here?
Well, if you understand what the mechanism of mass formation, the better you understand it, the more you understand that it is a phenomenon that is provoked and created by the voice of someone. And this mass formation is identical to hypnosis. Identical, it's the same. In a hypnotic procedure, there is someone, a hypnotist, who withdraws the attention of someone else from the environment and who then focuses it all on one small aspect of reality. And as soon as that happened, as soon as all the attention of someone is focused on one aspect of reality, then it is as if the rest of reality doesn't exist anymore. And you can, and I've seen with my own eyes how you can perform an operation, a surgical operation, using just a simple hypnotic procedure. A simple hypnotic procedure is sufficient to make someone radically insensitive to the pain involved in a surgical operation. A simple hypnotic procedure is sufficient to allow a surgeon to cut through the skin, the flesh, even straight through the breastbone, to perform an open heart operation without the patient knowing it. So that shows the power and the strength of this mechanism of the focusing of attention on one small aspect of reality. That's exactly what happens in a mass formation. In a mass formation, first, people's attention is disconnected from the environment. All the psychological energy is withdrawn from the environment. So this first stage always happens spontaneously, and is a consequence of this mechanistic fuel man in the world, this industrialization, use of technology, the excessive use of technology, and then it's all and then there is this narrative that is distributed through the mass media, focusing all the attention on one small aspect of reality, and then the rest of reality seems not to exist anymore. And so mass formation is similar to hypnosis. It is always provoked by someone who articulates a narrative or a certain ideologically colored narrative. And as soon as you understand that mass formation can also be disturbed by a voice. And that's exactly the first and foremost strategical advice that you can give when a mass formation emerges, when there is a trend towards totalitarianism and mass formation in a society. It's of crucial importance that the dissonant voices continue to speak out. Because when the people who don't buy into the narrative, who are not in the grip of mass formation, continue to speak out, and this was already observed and described by Gustave Le Bon in the 19th century, when these people continue to speak out, they might not succeed in waking up the masses, because that's extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult. But that doesn't mean that their speech is without effect. Their speech has an effect. It constantly disturbs the mass formation, and it makes sure that the mass formation doesn't reach that level of depth that the people in the masses and their leaders become convinced that they should destroy everyone who doesn't go along with them. So that's the most crucial advice that you can give when you want to resist mass formation and totalitarianism. People have to continue to speak out. And history shows us what happens if people stop to speak, if the people resisting the mass formation stops to speak out. That happened in 1930 in the Soviet Union, and in 1935 in Nazi Germany. At that moment, the resistance stopped to speak out. They went underground, and what happened? Within a period of 6 months, the destruction campaigns started. So dissonant voices have to continue to speak out. They don't have to try to convince the people in the masses. That won't work, and you might feel disappointed if you try to do that. But it's just, the crucial thing is that people just articulate their own opinion, that they just live up to the ethical duty every human being has of articulating the words that emerge in himself and that seem sincere and honest, and not in a pushy way. Just if someone says something through which he shows that he strongly believes in the mainstream narrative, it's good to say, okay, I have a different opinion, and I will just articulate it, and then you can do with it what you want. That's the most important thing in any respect. That's what is most effective to prevent mass formation leading to this cruelty and this radical destruction of everyone who doesn't go along with the masses. And that's on the short term. It also has a very specific effect. It's not only important for yourself. If the people who do not go along with the masses don't want to be dehumanized completely and destroyed, they have to speak out. But it's also important for the masses themselves, because the masses might not realize it, but as soon as they would have destroyed the people who do not go along with them, they will start to destroy themselves. That's what typically happens. Every mass in the end becomes self-destructive. It typically becomes a monster that devours its own children. So you should also speak out for the masses themselves. And also, like, if you speak out, if you live up to this ethical duty of producing what the ancient Greeks called already truth speech, then you will see that while the mass formation happens, you go through a very fast process of mental and psychological evolution yourself. Speaking out, just practicing the art of good speech is something that propels you, that makes you evolve very fastly, makes you go through a very intense and fast spiritual and psychological evolution. And it is at that moment, it is there that we can find meaning in what happens now. A mass formation is not meaningless. A mass formation is like a large organism that puts pressure on a smaller organism, on a group that doesn't go along with the masses, and that forces this group on a path where it wouldn't go without the masses, and which in this way forces it through a very fast evolution. And if you can look at the process like this, in that way, then you will find meaning in what is happening now. And you will see that this entire crisis and this entire process of mass formation just had to happen, that it happens for a reason, and that it leads to something fruitful in the end.
So, Mattias, is there a paradox or maybe a silver lining in the fact that right now you and I are able to speak about this by means of technology that would never have existed, right? Did not exist before. So doesn't the technology in a way also, I mean, to some extent decentralizes things and allow people to bypass the authority of, I mean, I know it can be used both ways, but so far it has eluded the complete control of the totalitarian regime.
Definitely. Technology is a wonderful tool to spread information. It helps people connect. It can help people connect to a certain extent. In my book, I give I discuss the difference between the real conversations and digital conversations, and I show that through digital conversations are very effective for the dissemination of information, but they reduce the resonance between the physical resonance between people that speak to each other. So I think technology has advantages and disadvantages. And as you say, it's definitely true. The social media and technology allow people during the Corona crisis, for instance, who are Corona skeptical, who are skeptical with respect to the mainstream narrative, to connect to each other, to learn to know each other. The technology helps to spread a critical and skeptical information. So that's also why I expect, to be honest, I expect that in the next years, there might be more and more censorship, and people who do not go along with the technocratic system might be barred or denied access, I think, to the social media. That's what I expect. And but of course, that won't prevent us to speak. We will speak out in a different way then. But I do believe that we will be denied access, I think, to the social media, to the media.
Right.
I know more and more people, more and more experts, critical experts, such as, there are so many people.
Right.
Someone sent me a list this morning.
Give us a glimpse of you talked about this as being a short-term solution to sort of diffuse the mass formation from devouring the whole planet. But what are the long term? Because we're as we mentioned, this is part of a sort of a secular trend, this mechanistic ideology. What is your view of how to transcend this and go beyond it?
Yes, and in the end, we have to move beyond this mechanist ideology. And the great seminal scientists showed us already how to do that, and to a certain extent. They all started from this mechanist, rationalist view on man and the world. But after a while, they all left it behind. They all claimed that that part of reality, and they quote René Thom now, one of the most famous scientists, one of the most famous mathematicians of the 20th century, and one of the founders of complex dynamical systems theory. I quote, "This part of reality that can be understood in a rational way is very limited, and the rest of reality we can only understand by empathically resonating with it." And that's exactly what we need to do. We have to move beyond this idea, that this illusion, that rational understanding can grasp the essence of life around us. We can only connect to the essence, to the core of life around us, to the core of nature, to the core of other human beings, by empathically resonating with it. And of course, it's not easy to define what it is, that empathically resonating with it. But for instance, the samurai culture in Japan was perfectly aware of these two types of knowledge, this rational knowledge on the one hand, and this more resonating knowledge. And they claim for every art, when we learn an art or when we learn a craft, for instance, there is this first rational stage in which we learn certain rules, certain technical rules in a rational way. But if we practice these rules a lot, if we practice a lot in the art that we want to know or that we want to learn, then we slowly will start to develop a certain feeling with what we are doing, a certain feeling that is more a resonating knowledge that transcends the rational knowledge. And in the end, there is this proverb in Japan which says that you first have to protect the rules of an art and the techniques of an art. And then you have to break them and leave them behind. And it is at that moment that you break the technical rules that you become a master in the art you're learning or in the craft you're learning. And the samurai said that it's one thing to learn fighting techniques or the techniques of the samurai. But that is even much more difficult to forget the rules again, the technical rules. And they said, they warned everyone, if you go to the battlefield and you did not forget your technical rules again, that you would die on the battlefield. And it's not only in swordsmanship or in martial arts, it's in every art the same. It's in every science the same. You first proceed through rational analysis, rational knowledge, by learning rational rules. But after a while, you start to feel that all these rational rules are limited and that the essence of the object you're studying or of the art you're learning is beyond these rules. And that it is first, at the moment, you have access to this different kind of knowledge, this feeling, this resonating knowledge, that you have access to the core, to the essence of what you're learning or of what you're studying. And this, you have to get in touch with something that transcends all rational knowledge. And it is in that way that you start to get in touch with the eternal principles of life around you, I think, or that it's something that I like to refer to as the eternal principles of life, certain ethical principles also, which transcend rational understanding. And that is the moment. I think that's the moment. That's the kind of knowledge, the kind of resonating knowledge that we should start to be aware of, and we should start to realize that rational understanding can never be the cornerstone or the basis of human living together. That's impossible. That's the illusion of totalitarianism. All totalitarianism starts from this idea that a kind of theory, a kind of, they usually don't call it an ideology, but a kind of rational theory, such as the race theories or historical materialism or transhumanism, a kind of theory should be relentlessly imposed to society, that society should be reshaped according to a pseudo-rational and pseudo-scientific theory. And that in this way, they will be able to create like a new society, a kind of a rationalistic paradise, but that's just an illusion. That's something that was so nicely shown by systems theory. Complex dynamical systems theory showed, paradoxically, in a strictly rational way, that the core and essence of every complex dynamical system is irrational in nature, that it behaves as an irrational number in mathematics. And so science itself showed us how limited rational understanding is and always will be, always will be. And so that's what we have to become aware of, that that rationality is very good. We should go follow rationality until the limit, until we reach that point where we can clearly see that beyond that point, rationality has no grip anymore on reality and or the phenomena that we want to study or the objects that we want to know. And it's that new knowledge, that awareness of this new knowledge, which is at the same time also a knowledge and awareness of the eternal principles of life. It's that what should become the center of a new society and of a new way to live together as human beings. And that we can expect everything of this new knowledge and these principles of life. I don't know if you're familiar with Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I have his book here right beside me. He wrote this wonderful book, The Gulag Archipelago. He wrote it on the basis of his stay in the concentration camps of Stalin. And he described how in the concentration camps, in the gulags, in the Soviet Union, most prisoners started to behave in a radically beast-like manner. They crushed each other's skulls in order to steal each other's food and clothes during the night. And in the end, they became even worse for each other than the guards were already for them. But Solzhenitsyn describes how a small group of prisoners went in exactly the opposite direction. How in this pool of darkness, they became more and more determined to represent a little bit of light themselves. And they more and more stayed loyal to their ethical principles. They more and more became aware of the principles of humanity and stuck to these principles. And Solzhenitsyn describes one prisoner in particular, a guy called Ivanovich Grigoriev, I think, who went very far in this direction. And he entered the concentration camps in a sickly way. But when other prisoners stole his food or his clothes, he refused to steal clothes and food himself. And when the guards commanded him to do something he considered unethical, he just refused to do it, no matter what the punishment was he received for his refusal. And Solzhenitsyn describes how this guy, who entered sickly, became stronger and stronger. And while most prisoners died in a period of a few weeks to a few months, this guy survived the concentration camps for something like 15 years, if I'm not mistaken. And he just, throughout this process, he became stronger and stronger at the mental level, at the psychological level, but also at the physical level. And of course, not everybody who sticks to his principles will become stronger and stronger and survive the concentration camps. But still, Solzhenitsyn said how this showed how the process the prisoners went through, who stayed loyal to the principles of humanity, showed him and convinced him what the crucial importance was of these principles for the human being. And these principles you can never articulate them or put them into words in a definitive way. You can only feel them. You can only resonate with them. And we all have to reinvent these principles of humanity time and time again. We have to re-articulate them. But that is I think, the essence of the process that will manifest now in the world. There will be a group who dehumanizes radically in the years to come.
Yes.
And there will be another group who tries to remain human in this dehumanizing world, and who will be forced upon a path where it will rediscover the principles of humanity, and where it will become capable of organizing a new way or of inventing a new way of living together. And while the first group, the large group who dehumanizes, will become weaker and weaker, that's typically what happens. A mass formation exhausts itself always. In the end, it always destroys itself. The small group will become stronger and stronger. And in the end, it will be ready at the perfect moment, I believe, to replace this entire technocratic ideology and impose new principles and a new way of living together. That's a natural process that might happen in the years to come, I think. But of course, there is one thing that is extremely important. The small group has to continue to speak out, because otherwise it will be destroyed. And that's the principles that we have to follow is quite easy. It's, if you continue to speak out, the mass formation will not reach that point where it starts to destroy everyone who doesn't go along with them. And in this way, it will exhaust itself before it destroyed everyone who didn't go along with it.
This is a very hopeful note, Mattias. You mentioned Solzhenitsyn. It echoes, I think, the experience that you're probably familiar with Viktor Frankl in the German concentration camps. This resilience, this focus on maintaining a sense of humanity. And it's interesting because Solzhenitsyn was a committed Orthodox Christian. Frankl was, I think, a secular Jew, if I understand correctly. There are other examples. So from a variety of, disparate traditions, it seems that this flame can be kept alive, so to speak. We'll see if we're on the cusp of a transformation going beyond this technological era. But whether we are or not, I would encourage people to read your book, and I think it's a terrific book, very timely. I think the response in social media to your interviews a few months ago indicated to what extent people are looking for answers such as what you're talking about. Mattias, do you have a website for the book or not? Or I can just put some links. I know it's available on Amazon, and it's about to be published or about to be released. And I will have a link on the show notes.
Oh, thank you very much, Michel.
But we are very appreciative of the work that you've done and of the voice that you've expressed throughout these months. You and some others have been extremely helpful to a lot of people. I think that's really quite well recognized, and it confirms what you're talking about in your book, that the importance of that voice of dissent against totalitarianism that gives us a lot of hope. Thank you very much for joining us.
And thank you for inviting me, Michel, and for listening to me. Thank you.
My pleasure.